Howdy, partners. That is my warmest greeting in the name of this YouTube show that I somehow suckered the bosses at ESPN into giving me. I am Tim MacMahon. On this show, we will bounce around the rest of the West in the NBA. And I say the rest of the West because Ohm Youngmisuk and Dave McMenamin, they've got This Is OD, their own YouTube show focusing on LA. And we all know with Dave and Ohm, you do not want to mess with their turf. So we will stay away from LA, focus on the rest of the West. And this week, with my esteemed guest, Andrew Lopez, my colleague at ESPN. Andrew, let's focus on the Western Conference and let's start on your turf. Those New Orleans Pelicans, the Fighting Zions. I would say there's probably as much excitement, as much buzz about the Pelicans, perhaps as there's been since they were the Hornets. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a lot of good mojo, a lot of good voodoo going in this season for the little Pelicans.
I'd say so. I mean, thinking about it, you go back to, really the kind of like the Chris Paul, David West teams, 07, 08. I mean, this has really been definitely since they've turned to the Pelicans. Because I think the one year that they had a bunch of hype coming off of the sweep of Portland, it was the Boogie AD thing was going to work. And then Boogie tears his Achilles. He doesn't re-sign. Unbeknownst to everybody else, AD basically says in September to his teammates, I'm out after the season, guys. Don't worry about it. And that never took off. This one feels a little bit different. As David Griffin put it, this is the first time since they've been here that maybe the external expectations are going to meet the internal expectations for what they have, which is just a convoluted way of saying people are going to expect us to be good this year. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true. So you took a team that on the surface, it doesn't look like it because you take a team that went 36-46 last year and you're like, all right, that's not great. But when you realize they started 3-16, okay, it looks a little bit better. They finished 33-30. They were over 500 with Brandon, CJ playing together. Then go over 500 period with CJ in those 28 games if you include the two playing games. So you take all of that and you basically bring the entire team back. The only guy you're really losing off of last year is Tony Snell and Gary Clark, and you replace them with Dyson Daniels and Zion Williamson, who averaged 27-7 the last time we saw him when he played 61 or 72 games in 2021. So, and he's looked like he's in the best shape of his NBA career, and he's
not to damn him with faint praise, but yes.
Look, and also I think right now the effort on the defensive end is there. And I think that's obviously the key part here for the Pels. The offense is going to be there, but what is it going to look like on the defensive end?
Well, and look, for most of last year, the big question, there was a lot of questions, obviously, about Zion's health, about Zion's weight. I blurted out on Zach Lowe's low post that he was up to 330 at one point. That is a fact. He's nowhere near 330 right now. No. And the other question was his commitment to New Orleans. There was so much, and it wasn't just media talk. This was reality. Now, to David Griffin's credit, he made an aggressive trade to go out and get CJ McCollum. And in hindsight, given the way things played out, really didn't give up that much to do it. And I didn't like that trade at the time. I thought it was a desperation move, a win now move for a team that wasn't positioned to really win at the time. But look, I see it now. I see that that move gave them momentum to end the season. It gave them a guy who's not just a scorer and a creator and a playmaker, a guy who can play on the ball or off the ball, but it gave them a leader. And they got Zion sitting on the bench during the playoffs, and he sees, man, these guys are putting up a fight against the number one seed without me. This is something I want to be on board with. And so not only did Zion sign a contract, but he signed, it's a max deal, right? But it is as team-friendly a max deal as you can possibly find, essentially with the weight clauses, body fat clauses, all that. What it is a 5-year max that's a series of team options. And obviously the Pelicans want to essentially pick up those options. They're not looking to run Zion off, but they have his full commitment. And, I question like, hey, man, I know your stepdad's been a huge influence in your life, like, but they've got this whole like coaching staff, player development coaches, work with those guys. But I'll say this, not and working with Jasper Bibbs instead of the Pelicans strength and conditioning coaches on a consistent basis all summer. You can question that, but the guy showed up much, much leaner, and a lean, in shape Zion with Brandon Ingram as the number 2, CJ McCollum as the number 3. Herb Jones covering everybody, Jose Alvarado just being a pain in every point guard's ass.
Herb Jones blocked Doug McDermott's 3-pointer last night or the other night while being screened by Gorgie Jang. Like he was there was contact on the screen.
Yes.
And Herb just reaches up and just crushes Doug McDermott's shot. It's
Go.
I'm going to go look at the video. I'm going to go look at the video of that as soon as we finish this again for the 80th time.
But yeah, they've got this really interesting. They have a couple, a little bit of veteran leadership in McCollum, Jonas Valanciunas, and then they've got just this nice young core. I would say Ingram is approaching his prime. Zion's approaching his prime. All their rookies from last year. It's set up to where and they've got guys under contract. CJ signed the extension. Yeah. Obviously Zion with a 5-year deal. Ingram's on a long-term deal. We can go on down the list. This is set up, and they've got picks. So this is set up for the Pelicans to be very intriguing now with the arrow pointing up, and potentially a multi-year window for them to make some noise.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing, going back to what you had mentioned about the CJ McCollum trade, the biggest thing about that to me was it gave them another adult in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what they needed. They had Garrett Temple, who has a lot of influence in that locker room, but it helps, I think, when that guy is your starting point guard. And you saw a difference there. CJ told me, look, he would sit next to Zion at team dinners on West Coast road trips late in the season. Z has kind of mentioned a bunch of, stuff that CJ's tried to put him on in terms of getting his body ready and what to eat and all this kind of stuff, on top of the things that he's doing right now. And you have seen that level of commitment from Z, and then you add in everything else on that team, and I think it starts to work. You mentioned the contracts. I think Z, CJ, Brandon, they're all locked in for at least the next 3 years. Z's really locked in for the next 6. There's no player option on that max, so he's in because that extension starts next year. CJ's now, I think, tied for 4 more years. I don't think anybody's really on an expiring right now, which you sound like, okay, maybe you're locked into, this roster, but I think it also, you have a lot of tradable numbers on this roster.
They've got tradable contracts, they've got picks, and they have players who are ascending. That's a really nice blend. You
got some mixes in there to get around. There's a nice blend of guys on on rookie deals. Your Trey Murphys, your Jose's, Herb Jones, Dyson Daniels, who they think can be something very, very special, who they got with the number 8 pick. You mentioned, they didn't end up having to give up much for that deal for CJ, how it all kind of shaked out. I think part of that thing that fixed it was the fact that the Lakers pick ended up top 10. You get a guy like Dyson Daniels, and all of a sudden it doesn't look as bad when you're sending out, a Milwaukee first or anything like that, while still having to send some things down the line to Charlotte for that Devontae Graham deal. Offensively, this team is going to be very, very good. You have Zion, you have CJ, you have Brandon, you have JV, all guys who can give you 20 any night. Herb Jones is just there just to do everything that Herb Jones does. So far in the preseason, they've had, I know it's a preseason, but Devontae Graham has come off the bench and they gave him 21 one game. The next night, Jose Alvarado came off the bench and gave him 28. Jose Alvarado, who has worked with Tony Parker this summer on his floater and layups and trying to, his Giant Slayer badge for you 2K out there, trying to finish around the rim and things like that. And then Trey Murphy started against the Spurs in the third game and came out and gave you 28 as well. And or 27. And all 3 of those guys are projected to come off the bench this year. You still have Larry Nance in that group. Jackson Hayes isn't probably going to be able to start the season because of an elbow injury, but it's a lot to like right there. And I think
no question.
It to me, it comes back to defense. This team can be, I'd say, probably your ceiling is, you're looking at like a top 5 offense. If you can just get to 15 on defense, then I think you're in a special category. I think if you can just be 18 to 20, that'll be enough to maybe get you out of the play-in.
And going from your backyard to my backyard, from one superstar that's had a lot of focus on his conditioning to another superstar who's had a lot of focus on the conditioning. And it is an interesting comparison going from the Pelicans to the Mavericks, because basically it's the same challenge for both franchises. You have a potentially generational superstar to build around, and there's pressure that comes along with it to build a championship piece. And in a lot of ways, what we're talking about with the Pelicans is they're better set up. They have a no doubt legitimate number 2 guy in Brandon Ingram, a proven big time number 3 offensive option in CJ McCollum. You look at the Mavericks and you don't necessarily see that on the roster. They lost their second best player from last year's West Finals run for nothing. And when Jalen Brunson left for free agency to the Knicks. You mentioned a lot of the young talent that the Pelicans have. The fact they're still plus on picks. The Mavericks still owe a pick from the Porzingis deal. The Josh Green has shown some signs, but he's a question mark. They don't have these promising, recent first round picks, or in Herb Jones' case, guys who should have been first round. Hell, in Alvarado's case, guys who should have been first round picks. What the Mavericks do have, though, is a superstar who has proven that he is an MVP caliber player, who's the MVP favorite going into this year. And actually, I think it's the 3rd straight year that Luka Doncic has been the MVP favorite. Obviously hasn't won it yet, but at 23 years old, he is a 3-time first-team All-NBA selection, something that since the NBA-ABA merger, only Kevin Durant can make that same claim. And so I think when you're looking at the West, just because of the Luka factor and the fact that Luka comes into this camp in shape, unlike the last 2 years when he kind of had to play his way into shape, I think you do put the Mavericks.
Eurobasket.
Yeah, hey, he got beat up, but you don't have to worry about whether he's in game shape. He didn't show up weighing 260 something. I think you put the Mavericks above the Pelicans in the pecking order, and the Mavericks have really good role players. Dorian Finney-Smith is one of the best 3-and-D players in the league. Reggie Bullock, who's guards all the point guards that you're going to have to run across in the Western Conference, proved he's a really good fit. In Jalen Brunson, obviously you're missing scoring. They're hoping Tim Hardaway Jr. coming back from injury can fill some of that void. They're hoping the trade for Christian Wood, when they basically gave up a bunch of end-of-bench fodder and a late first-round pick, they're hoping he can fill that scoring void. But it's hard to, you make this run to the West, lose your West Finals, you lose your second best player for nothing. It's hard to look at that and say the Mavericks took a step forward and potentially took a significant step back.
Yeah, the thing with Luka, though, still, when you just even compare him to the Pels, I mean, it's proven. There's a longer track record there of just 85 games of what your superstar can do when he's on the floor. Hell, I have money on him to win the MVP if I could, that would be my guy, right? And I think where that goes, you also look at the different rosters. The Mavs roster is just a much older roster. Mm-hmm. You're hoping on guys who don't break down. Christian Wood is a very interesting player to me. We have seen him in multiple different locations now. Just put up ridiculous numbers. We saw it in New Orleans for about a month and a half when Anthony Davis was there, and you're like, okay, maybe it's it's March, it's April numbers. Is it just because it's March or April numbers, or is it a real thing? And then he goes to Detroit and he puts up numbers. Then he goes to Houston and he puts up numbers. Now he's got the chance to do it on a team that is going to win games or should win games, which is not something he has had so far in his career. And I know he's, whether he's the sixth man or whatever role they're going to have for him, he is going to be, I think, on the floor at the end of games. And
I'm not certain about that. I'm not certain about that
you don't think they finished with him at the 5?
Here honestly, JaVale McGee's starting at the 5. Christian Wood's going to be a 6-man. Matter of fact, the starters wear white during practice. Each practice jersey has a white and blue side. I'm not sure. I think his jersey might just have 2 blue sides. I literally have not seen him wear white one time when we walk into practice. And the reason I say I'm not sure is because I think that obviously Luka is going to be on the floor. Okay, Dorian Finney-Smith will be starting and finishing games. Spencer Dinwiddie, I think, is going to be a closer. I think Reggie Bullock's going to be on the floor for the vast majority of those times. And then I think the center position to close games could very well be situational. I think there might be times where they want size, they want rim protection, they want rebounding. They go with JaVale McGee. Obviously, Christian Wood gives them a scoring, not just scoring, but shooting, a little bit of ability to put the ball on the floor, can finish. I mean, he's a really, really talented offensive player. But if they're prioritizing, hey, we want to be able to space the floor and defend, Maxi Kleber might be the 5 on the floor to finish games. So maybe there's sometimes they put some combination of 2 of those 3 guys out there. My point is, I don't think it's a sure thing that Christian Wood is closing games. And, the other day, Wood's been great in the preseason. I mean, the numbers are just off the charts. Now, it's preseason against the Thunder and the Orlando Magic. It's pretty favorable circumstances. But, he's asked about his role, and, the media day thing, well, this is the first time I'm hearing about it. It's like, dude, this thing's been forecast all summer long. Come on now. And then the other day he's asked about it. He said, I'm embracing my role. And then he said something along the lines, I could pout and do all these extra things, but, essentially, I want to win.
I won't.
And okay, so, hey, he needs to prove it. And let's just be straight up. Why did he bounce around the league so much? Why did Detroit make no effort to keep him after he put up numbers? Why were the Rockets so eager to trade him? He's got a bad reputation. He's got a reputation for being late all the time. He's got a reputation for being lazy, especially on the defensive end. He's got a reputation, even though he's been efficient, he's got a kind of an empty stats sort of a reputation. So this is a chance for him to prove that he can be part of a winning team, but it's not going to be in the kind of role that he wants in a contract year. And so I think there's a huge variation on what could happen with Christian Wood in Dallas. I think he could be 6th man of the year, or I think he could be gone by the trade deadline. I think there's that wide of a variance.
So you mentioned the trade deadline. I was going to ask, we've mentioned all of these different, essentially 4s, guys who can play the 4, guys who can play the 5. Do you see them trying to make a move to maybe get off of one of those guys and bring in somebody who can help in the backcourt?
Not necessarily to get off of one of those guys. They just signed Max.
And not necessarily to get off to we got to get rid of this guy, but we have a little bit of a surplus at a certain position. We can use that someplace else.
They only have 2 proven ball handlers on this roster. One is Luka, one is Spencer Dinwiddie. If you look at maintenance with those 2 guys, they're probably going to miss 10 plus games each. And so you're looking at on the, if you're being optimistic, 20 games where you only have one real ball handler. And hey, can Frank Ntilikina do it? Josh Green's not a point guard, not really a proven rotation player. We think he's ready to make a leap, though. Can he do it? They kind of looked at Dennis Schroeder before he went to the Lakers. J. Kidd decided that he didn't want Goran Dragic. They kind of offered, hey, you want to be a foot shorter version of Boban and sit at the end of the bench? He was like, hell no, I'm going to go somewhere where I can play. I'm not here to babysit Luka. There's some talk about Facu Campazzo, but it's not. Look, the Nuggets are a win now team. Didn't try to keep him, so I don't know what that.
Right.
So I think that you're going to see them looking for help there. Maybe it ends up being a buyout guy. Maxi Kleber sure ain't getting traded. He just got extended. I don't necessarily think they're looking at, hey, we've got a surplus in the front court. as much as what can we do to the backcourt. But the one thing I will say about the Mavericks in the trade market, and I've said this over and over again, they're minus a pick. They still owe a pick for Porzingis, and then they're full there. They can't be giving up draft capital for moves that make them a little bit better.
Right.
They've got to keep those things, able to be bundled up, because they need a move. It's not necessarily even this year, but at some point in the next couple of years before you start getting to the back half of Luka's contract, they need a move that makes them, they need a co-star. Jalen Brunson was the closest thing. He's gone for nothing. And the fact is, not getting an extension done with him when they could have robbed them of what would have been their best trade asset. So they've got the most difficult piece to find. They've got some nice pieces around him, but there's some pretty significant pieces to the puzzle that the Mavericks are missing and that are easy. It's easy to talk about. It's hard to get it done. That's Nico Harrison's job as a GM with 1 year of experience under his belt. Let's hop to the other playoff team from the Southwest Division, talking about the Memphis Grizzlies. And, this is a team that made a massive leap last year, made that, and the kind of leap the Pelicans are hoping to make this year. Went from the play-in scenario to 56 wins to the number 2 seed in the Western Conference. I think if you ask the players on the roster, if Ja Morant doesn't go down, they think they beat the Warriors. I happen to disagree, but they have that kind of confidence, and they had.
I'd like for them to have that kind of confidence. If you can, you want your team to have that, but yeah.
Well, one thing I don't think you ever have to worry about with the Grizzlies is whether they have confidence.
Yes. That is a fact for sure.
They have confidence in bundles. And so I'm going to hit on a few of what I'm going to say are the kind of the major questions for the Grizzlies. You're a proven playoff team. Not just that, you've got a playoff series victory under your belt. Can you be a bona fide contender? And so, there's a few questions there. Number one, quite simply, hey, when is Jaren Jackson going to get healthy? And, is he going to be able to come back and get in a rhythm and be kind of a two-way major force? That's probably the biggest question for this team going into the season.
Yeah. The thing with Jaren is, I think sometimes we kind of, his value is kind of all over the place. I mean, this was a guy who was, when he was playing last year, a legitimate defensive player of the year candidate. Was talked about as, a centerpiece of a Kevin Durant deal if Memphis wanted to get into that. And, he's on his big deal now, but his health has been a question. And I think if he gets back sooner rather than later, that's obviously a big step for Memphis in the right direction. But look, this was a guy who was, like I said, legitimately a defensive player of the year candidate last year. And when you have a fun team like this who wants to get up and down, and you have somebody who can defend like that on the other end, because you also have Steven Adams back there, cleaning up boards for 25 minutes a game, but you need a shot blocker. And that's what Jaren can do. He can protect, he can defend on the perimeter. And he fits this team so well, and is a big piece of what they can do. And frankly, they need him back they need him back sooner rather than later, but I think they need him back at 100% more than anything else.
Right. And it sounds like it will be sooner than later. His progression from the broken foot he suffered this summer, by all indications coming out of Memphis, is going well. I think he will be closer to Halloween than he is Christmas. They're very careful not to put a real specific timetable on it, but it does sound like optimism there.
Foot injuries can be tricky.
Yes. Now, I don't think he's ballooning up to 330. I'll say that. So he was a dominant defense player. He had a bad year offensively last year.
Yeah.
And they need him getting back to being the kind of complementary scoring threat that he was Ja's rookie year. Remember, he was a high volume dude from 3-point range, shooting in the high 30s. For 6'11", 240, he has the ability to do some things off the dribble. Obviously, he's athletic. He can finish. He's been so interrupted by injuries, but last year he shot the three in the low 30s. They felt like maybe his footwork got a little out of whack. it's such a big difference if he's that guy you've got to worry about as a big time 3-point threat versus him not being. And then, I think when we're looking at questions on this team, the next big one is on Ja Morant, a guy who, had an all NBA season last year. No question he's a superstar. I would say probably the most exciting player to watch in the league, with apologies to, like when Steph's cooking, I'll lean towards Steph, but I mean, there's highlights every night, above the rim, below the rim, passing. I mean, he's just fastest guy in the league, I think. Is he going to be a defensive deficiency his whole career? Because that puts a limit on the Grizzlies, and he's aware of this. When I was there, he talked about, look, he's a skinny guy. He's 6'3", he's skinny. And, teams obviously going to try to wear him down. They're just going to put a bullseye on him, but he's smart. He's got to be able to disrupt plays because he knows they're coming. He talked about that. He's got to be active. He can't just be taking possession after possession after possession off, especially when teams are trying to target him. I know he's a competitor. I need to see him compete doing the dirty work and not just, the glitz and glamour type of stuff.
And it's not necessarily that he needs to go out there and turn into Marcus Smart, right? Like he doesn't have to go out there and be this elite perimeter defender. You just have to have passable defense.
Mm-hmm.
And, if you're going to be timing steals, or you got to limit that, you can't gamble, a lot during, even though if you do have, Jaren Jackson, whoever else back there. But I think we're seeing that right now I'm seeing it in New Orleans with Z, a guy who did not have great, defensive tendencies in his first 2 seasons that he played, really start to buy in on that end because he sees other guys around him doing it. And I think when you see other guys competing on your team and giving it all on that end, it helps you. All right, I can give it a little bit more right now. Yeah. I can buy in just a little bit. And I think if he gets just to the point where, like I said, he has passable defense, average defense, then, Memphis can stay in that top 2-3 conversation that they put themselves in last year.
I like the word that Jason Kidd uses for what they ask of Luka Doncic defensively: participate. You can't just take possessions off, participate. Right. And look, understand these guys have so much of a load on them offensively. It's hard to play hard on both ends, right? But they're going to scheme defensively. You're always going to get the easiest assignment. They're going to scheme to try to protect you as much as possible. You have to participate within a scheme that's trying to minimize your responsibilities. And like you said, Ja has had a ton on his plate offensively, because part of it is because he's so damn good. And honestly, that part of the reason they traded Valanciunas for Steven Adams is because with Valanciunas, you need to feed him. You need to let him touch the ball in the post. They're like, dude, why we don't want giving him 6-8 post up a game and taking the ball out of Ja's hands. Now, they do feel like Desmond Bane, who obviously made a massive jump last year, is ready to make another jump, right? Yeah. And if he makes another jump, he's an all-star. They feel like he's ready to make another jump, particularly as a playmaker. And Bane last year, he told me he weighed between 235 and 240 last year, right? And he said, look, that's probably has a lot to do with why my back acted up on me during the playoffs. He's leaned up. Now he still has the Popeye arms. He ain't lost any weight on the biceps, but he told me he weighed 224 now. He's feels like he's moving better. He's quicker. And again, I think there will be times where they put the ball in Bane's hands, in part because they think he's more than capable and they think he's ready to, again, be in that all-star. He was kind of on the fringe of the conversation. They think he's a legit all-star caliber player, but also if you put the ball in Bane's hands, then it reduces the load a little bit on Ja Morant. Now, one guy they don't want trying to create, and this leads to, who I'm talking about.
I know exactly who you're talking about.
This is the third big question. And who do you think I'm talking about?
I think you're talking about Mr. Brooks.
The Dylan the villain. And they love so much of what Dylan Brooks brings to this team. When you talk about kind of the swagger, the toughness, the tenacity. Yes. A lot of that's Dylan Brooks, man. I mean, he is legitimately one of the best wing defenders, really 1 through 4 defenders in the league. He's the 4th or 5th offensive option, and he has to accept that. He has to embrace that. He has to understand the shots he gets are going to be created for him most of the time. They're going to be catch and shoot threes, maybe attacking a closeout, stuff in transition. If he's dribbling the ball and takes a mid-range shot, it better be because the buzzer for the shot clock's going off right as he's releasing it. And he's in a contract year. I think the biggest mistake Dillon Brooks can make is to correlate his next contract with his points per game, because the way the Grizzlies are looking at it is his fit, and they really, really want him to be a fit moving forward. He is part of that core. They want him to be that, but not if it comes at the expense of offensive efficiency with a team that has one proven superstar option, another guy they think is an all-star, and with Jaren Jackson, the guy who's at least shown that kind of potential. So, Dillon Brooks' acceptance of his role, I think it could be the difference between him being with the Grizzlies for years to come or between him being shopped around the trade deadline.
I think there's this added weight right now for guys who are defensive specialists, but let's not, I don't want to use the term 3-and-D. And I think some of these guys maybe think, if I don't do extra, if I don't handle it a little bit, then I'm just going to get labeled as this 3-and-D guy. Well, one, those guys are getting paid right now. Like there is
Dorian
some
Finney-Smith, see Lou Dort.
There is value. I was going to say Lou Dort is the guy right now that if I'm a 3-and-D guy, I'm looking at his deal and I'm going, I can get paid. I can just do what he does. And I think there's still this perception among guys that you have to do extra and you have to do more, and you don't. And if you can just go out there and play your role and get it where you can, you're going to be in a good spot. And I think, like you mentioned, you have Ja, you have Desmond Bane. When healthy, you have Jaren Jackson. I think, Steven Adams understands that. He just gets there, he gets his rebounds, and he just, I'm going to put it back.
Just got a nice little extension too.
There, he's good at getting those 2-year extensions. If you can just get there and play the offense will come, because teams are eventually going to be like, all right, they know they can't just leave you open. You're not a 3-and-D guy where you can just sit in the corner because you shoot 32%. Now, if you do what you do in the playoffs last year, then they'll start to test you and leave you a little bit when you were, shooting, I think 33 or 34.
Mm-hmm.
But it's accepting your role. I think we're seeing that a little bit more because those guys are still, getting paid right now.
And we go from the playoff teams in the Southwest to teams that they're hoping the future is a bit brighter, but teams that are in that Victor Derby.
I was going to say the Victor division of the Southwest Division.
And, the Rockets are at least at an interesting stage of the rebuild. Jalen Green, showed a ton of promise at the end of last season. It was like the perfect, they sat all their vets. Jalen Green scoring, an efficient 30 a night, and they're losing to secure the worst record in the league and the best lottery odds. So they feel like they've got one foundation piece there. They got Jabari Smith Jr., ended up 3rd in the draft, got him. And he's a really, really, I think until about the morning of the draft, people thought he was going number 1. He's a really interesting player, a 6'11" guy who can really shoot the ball, has the potential to be an elite defensive player. The comp that I get from scouts for him is Rashard Lewis with elite defensive potential. That's a pretty damn good player. So I think they've got 2 foundation pieces. And then, some guys who are interesting. Alperen Şengün.
Yeah.
Everybody I talk to around the league really likes him. I'm having a hard time, though, finding people who like him as a starter. But I like the Rockets giving him the chance to prove that he can be that type of guy this year. Christian Wood wasn't doing anything for them. He was a progress stopper. Let's see what Şengün can do in that starting role, because you can always transition him back to a reserve. They've got Jayshawn Tate. They signed to what I thought was a pretty team-friendly extension. I really like him as a role player. They've got some other young pieces. Eric Gordon is the vet there. At some point, they need to cash in that chip. They say that they have turned down first-round picks on multiple occasions. I would think they want to pounce on that sooner than later.
I think so.
and he's a guy who, look, playoff teams are going to want him if he's healthy. A guy who is a really good shooter, who is built like a fullback and has proven that he can guard elite scorers in the playoffs. Teams will want a guy like that in his contract year. The biggest question about the Rockets, as far as this rebuild goes, is Kevin Porter Jr. Rafael Stone, the Rockets GM, has a lot of, I would say, emotional equity in him. They didn't give up anything to get him. They literally gave up nothing. A top 55 protected pick. That's nothing, literally. But if he pans out, Rafael looks like a genius, and Rafael really likes him. They're Seattle guys. Porter, Scoot, as they call them. Could end up getting replaced by another Scoot, but that's neither here nor there. He's had the trauma in his life has been well chronicled, as has his off-court issues in the NBA, which is why Cleveland gave him up for nothing. We saw that pop up again last year where he stormed out of a game at halftime. Everybody I talked to about him says he is a good guy. He's a good young man. But at a certain point, the good but erratic is tough to rely on. And then there's the other simple fact of, I cannot find a single scout, executive, anybody with another team who believes that Kevin Porter Jr. is a starting point guard in the NBA, or in most cases, a point guard, period, in the NBA.
It's always been, it's kind of been a unique case study, just watching what they tried to turn him into. And then when he went there and they're like, hey, he's going to be the point guard. That's what we want him to be. And you're like, okay, that's all. I think a lot of teams are trying to look and see if that's what he can be. I think most people, same thing with you. They think he's just more of an off guard who can handle it at times. You don't necessarily want to assign him that duty full time. But the way the roster is kind of set up, it's, you look at, well, the Jalen's going to have the ball at certain times. Do you need a traditional true point guard on that team? And maybe you don't, if you're going to try to go forward with a backcourt of Kevin Porter and Jalen Green. Now we'll see how long that really goes. Obviously they could be very much in a scoot race sooner rather than later. The guy I like on this roster right now is one of their first round picks from this year is Tyree Eason, a kid who is coming from
look
LSU.
At you going to LSU. Look at you going to LSU.
I pander to my base. I know what I'm doing. But I got a chance to obviously I was going to see him more than others. And Tari was a kid who started at Cincinnati, transferred to LSU, basically came off the bench last year. As that team was, as when they were for Will, trying to figure out all sorts of things of how to really play last year. And Tari kind of embraced that bench role. Now he was, still playing 26, 28 minutes a game coming off the bench. But what you saw, I think, there was LSU kind of played this pressure defense, and you saw his block numbers and you saw his steal numbers, and you're like, all right, but it's a pressure defense. Like, okay, we'll see what we're doing. And what we've seen so far in the preseason, and what we've seen so far in summer league is, he's a legit guy and can be that defender, can be that kind of swing 3-4 guy. And I think he's a guy who a lot of teams, they're looking for that mold of player. But I think
he is a freak athlete, and he looked like, if you say, hey, talk about an NBA body. I mean, long arms, hands look like, baseball gloves, and just, athletic, big, strong. A scout I was talking to said, offensively, he kind of reminds him of like a like a TJ Warren or like a Cedric Ceballos, like not a guy who is going to be a go-to guy, but a guy who just is going to kind of get buckets and like get buckets. A lot of like, it's in transition, or it's like a cut to the basket, or it's like, hey, somehow he got this offensive rebound. He's putting it back, that sort of a thing. And like you said, just physically, he has big time defensive potential. I think the awareness was a big question mark on him going in the draft, but he's the guy they got with the Nets pick at 17, which obviously was about 11, 12, 13 spots higher than projected. And they control the Nets draft, essentially for a generation moving forward. Now, on the downside, they owe 2 picks and a swap, all lightly protected to the Thunder. But this is, they have the rights to their own pick this year. And again, you look at the top of this draft, whether it's Victor Wembanyama, you plug him in, Scoot Henderson, okay. One of the Thompson twins, we can go, like, this is a loaded draft at the top. And certainly I think the Rockets, they want to make progress this year. But I don't think and I know they're not necessarily measuring progress by wins and losses. If they have a lot of highly competitive losses and they're seeing development, they're young players, I think that the Tillman Fertitta and the Rockets front office would be quite happy with the job Stephen Silas has done this year. So going from Stephen Silas to Pop with the San Antonio Spurs, look, we're going to get some Pop sound bites. We'll keep an eye on some of the Spurs young players, but this is year one of a full-fledged teardown rebuild. So quite frankly, I don't have a whole lot to say about the Spurs right now.
Look, I saw the Spurs. What was that? Sunday night when was there to cover the Pels preseason game. It's going to be a long year, and I think the last time the Spurs really decided, okay, it's going to be a long year, they came out on the other side with Tim Duncan. I think that worked out for them.
And this might be the best big man prospect since Tim Duncan. Hey,
so
as I always say, the Spurs don't tank often, but when they do, there's a generational 7-footer at the top of the draft. They're well-timed tankers.
I will say this: like I was there the other. I don't think I saw Primo. Devin Vassell, I think, was out. So the Keldon Johnson is still gonna miss.
And those are the young players worth keeping an eye on. Also, look, is Jakob Poeltl getting traded? Will they move Doug McDermott for a second or two at some point? Like those sort of things. But as far as actually really focusing on the Spurs, what you're doing is you're logging on a tankathon and seeing, doing the daily little spin and seeing where they end up at the top of the lottery.
I miss doing my daily spin. That was part of my routine for quite a while.
All right. Well, this will be a weekly spin. Howdy Partners on YouTube, on ESPN's YouTube channels. And Andrew Lopez, you have survived being my first guest. I mean, this is like the Jose Alvarado rookie year. Didn't expect much out of you, but you really delivered and showed some potential.
I knew as soon as CJ McCollum had Brandon Ingram as his first guest, I knew that the bar for new ESPN shows was just set so high. I've been training. Totally I was worried about my wardrobe this morning, what I was going to wear for this show. I'm just
that's one thing you never got to worry about on my show.
Hey, I didn't know if it was coming down from somebody else, so I was glad to hear that we were t-shirts were a go on this one.
Well, Brandon Ingram's got a hell of a lot better hair than you, but that's okay.
I go and get a haircut right now.
Sounds good. Well, adios amigos.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN Plus.